Hello again, Coffee Chat people and Flat-Belly fellow travelers. We had a meeting last week and I'm a little bit late on getting a follow-up done here. Had a little bit of work to do. But anyways, our topic for our last meeting was this idea of our faults or our problems or our challenges in life actually potentially being our strengths, or seeing them in such a way that's a different perspective anyways. And this idea came to me as the result of me reading through this little book that my sister gave me. It's by a guy named Rudolph V. D'Souza, and it's called Cast Your Net into the Deep. And it's all about looking at ourselves in a way, our challenges in life, as sort of the first step or the first way for us to redeem, to recover, to grow, whatever you want to call it. And there's a really interesting story in here I found, which I just realized once I saw this was a perfect topic, because so often we get down in our troubles and so on and don't see them as anything as such, other than such rather. And this little story is called Be a Cracked Pot. Not a crackpot, but a cracked pot. I want to share it with you. I'll read it right from the book, and then I got a few comments to make on it. Here it goes. Be a cracked pot. A water bearer in India had two large pots, each hung from each end of a pole, which he carried across his shoulders. One of the pots had a crack in it, and the other pot was perfect and always delivered full portion to its end, all the way back to the master's house. The cracked pot always arrived only half full. For a full 2 years, this went on daily, with the bearer delivering only 1.5 pots to his master's house. Of course, the perfect pot was proud of his accomplishments, perfect to the end for which he was made. But the poor cracked pot was ashamed of its imperfection, and miserable that it was only able to accomplish half of what it had been made for. After 2 years of what it perceived to be a bitter failure, the cracked pot finally spoke to the water bearer by the stream one day. "I am ashamed of myself, and I want to apologize to you," he said. "Why?" asked the water bearer. "What are you ashamed of?" "I have been able for these past 2 years to deliver only half my load because of this crack in my side, which causes half the water to leak out all the way back to the master's house. Because of my flaw, you have to do all of this work, but you don't get full value for your efforts," the pot said. The water bearer felt sorry for the old cracked pot, and in his compassion he said, "As we return to the master's house this time, I want you to notice the beautiful flowers by the path." Indeed, as they went up the hill, the old cracked pot took a look at and noticed the sun warming the beautiful flowers at the side of the path. This cheered him some, but the end of the trail, it felt bad again, because it had leaked out half of its load, and so again it apologized to the bearer for its failures. The bearer said to the pot, "Did you notice that there were flowers only on your side of the path, but not on the other pot's side? That's because I have always known of your flaw, and I took advantage of it. I planted flower seeds on your side of the path, and every day while we walked back from the stream, you watered them. For 2 years, I have been able to pick these beautiful flowers to decorate my master's table. Without you being just the way you are, he would never have had this beauty to grace his house." Each of us has our own unique flaws. We are all cracked pots. Not crackpots, cracked pots. That's a story, and I was really inspired by it for a number of reasons, and I'll follow up here with a little bit of a few of my thoughts that came to this as a result. What I saw here was basically two pots, two selves, you might say, both ego-driven, living in ego. You had one proud pot, I'm so great, I'm perfect, ego, right? And the other pot, I'm so ashamed of myself. Both limited in a way, right? And I saw too, we can see here too, that for 2 years, this pot has stewed in itself about its perceived inadequacies. Good question for us is, how many of us have done the same? And for how many years? Now we can see the water bearer in many ways, but in one way we can see it is sort of like a voice, or a higher voice of reason, in a way, which goes counter to the narrow-minded, egoic sense that the cracked pot has of its limitations. This higher self was in a mode of seeing things on a grander scale. And it's not judgmental or condemnatory of the cracked pot, but rather he feels compassion for the ignorance of the pot's limited perception. And this higher self, you might say, or this water bearer, he does a fine job, a very smooth job of deflecting the pot's attention on his perceived inadequacies by suggesting them to look at the flowers. And how many times have we been suggested, or we've suggested to ourselves, to take time to smell the roses, to get off of our rut that we tend to get ourselves in sometimes. And once the pot has taken the time off of his limited perception, he actually feels better. You know, we've experienced that too, right? But as soon as the flowers are gone, he's at the end of the trail then, he goes back right onto his default looking at his limited self, poor me syndrome again, and he begins apologizing once again. But you see, by now, this higher self, or this water bearer, has set the stage for transformation to take place within the cracked pot, because he has allowed the cracked pot to experience at least a momentary experience of feeling better about himself by observing the flowers, taking his attention off of his perception, right? And this was done by, this happened within the cracked pot by allowing himself to feel the connection to that beauty, by seeing it and experiencing it and realizing, maybe not realizing, but at least experiencing it, the beauty of the flowers, which, as the bearer goes on to explain to the cracked pot, this is a benefit to the master, who is why they're delivering the water to, but this beauty that the cracked pot's perceived flaws have helped create, these flowers, have become far more significant to the master's household in terms of being able to give beauty, to lift the moods and spirits of those in the household, and so on, than any water could ever have done. And if we think about it, if we have a vase full of flowers and water in the vase, right, on our table, what do we put our attention on? Do we put our attention on the water, or do we put our attention on the flowers? The flowers are more significant. Yet the cracked pot was putting his attention only on his so-called flaws. And this was his bane in life, which, as it turns out, he was able to see through the help of this water bearer. This was actually his greatest strength. His perceived flaws, or his perceived flaw, his real flaw actually, as he perceived it as a flaw though, was actually his greatest strength. And as the story says, we too are all cracked pots in a way. Not crackpots, hopefully. Cracked pots. In other words, we can, if we want, find lots of flaws within ourselves. But do we go looking for them, or we just realize that we are what we are? But this is just one perception, that they're flaws. They're part of us. But if we continue to compare ourselves to others, which as we see this is also part of the story, because the crackpot, the only way that he could see that he was a failure was by comparing himself to the other guy who was proud of doing a perfect job all the time. And we human beings have that tendency within the ego living of saying, oh, this guy has done this, or this woman's doing this, and I'm inadequate, or what have you. There's always going to be a measuring up so long as we see ourselves as separate fundamentally. And this is what goes on too within this story of the cracked pot. So the question is, how can we let go of this egotistical tendency, once in a while at least, to see ourselves as the water bearer has saw the pot, as beautifully beneficial in so many ways, and having strength in our so-called weaknesses. Something to think about, don't you think? I'll talk to you again another time, and thank you for listening.